3, 2, 1.
Well, what's up, friends? Welcome back to another episode of the Metaverse Church Podcast. So here's what you don't know. I always want this episode, the show, to be in full transparency to you guys as followers and listeners. We owe that to you since you give us your time and attention. And yeah, this is definitely a re-record. Goose and I, we started this, and technology is like the greatest enemy and the greatest friend all at the same time. So the reason why I'm telling you this is because that's how I started the last one before we had to re-record, and it felt less authentic that go around. So that's my apologies to you. But either way, still, we're glad that you're here. We're glad that you're listening to and watching the Metaverse Church Podcast. Goose, what's up, man?
I'm impressed that you decided to give that a second go after the way the first one went, but that's all right.
I hold no shame. What can I say?
It's good. We accept your confession.
Yeah, thanks. This is my confession. Oh, sure. Hey, so we are doing pretty much a continuation from our last episode. So the 2 episodes ago, we did a talk on VR anonymity. So people like to, what feels like people are hiding in the metaverse world, but yet we get some full transparency and authenticity from people when we're in conversation with them. We talked about that 2 episodes ago. Last week, we talked about VR counseling. Like, can you truly and in a healthy way counsel somebody towards that idea of health and spiritual growth? And so many of you who might be church leaders who are listening to this and even asking the question, should our church dive into doing metaverse ministry at all? You might be asking the question, so how do we disciple people well? How do we counsel them? Can you do marriage counseling in this? And Goose, you started talking about this towards the end of the last episode, that you guys over at Cornerstone, you guys have started dabbling in what does it look like? What would it mean to do like premarital and marriage counseling for people within your guys' VR church? So you kind of want to talk about what that's looking like for you guys?
Yeah. So, we have talked about it theoretically because it's come up in theoretical questions, but more recently, in a very practical way, where we've got, in one instance, a couple who are asking those questions, and they're not quite ready yet, but they're very serious and wondering what that looks like, because they're trying to plan out, they're looking out ahead and saying, well, like, here's where this trajectory is going. What does that mean for us? And it's forced us to answer the questions in a much less theoretical way and say, hey, listen, if this keeps going, what are we going to do? What are we okay with? Because we want to advise them properly. We want to pastor them well. If we're okay with it, we want to let them know that that's okay. And if we're not okay with it, we want them to be able to make other plans, or again, just try to disciple them well. And so, I'll leave them anonymous for the sake of this conversation, but they are right now the one instance that has forced us to move from a theoretical to a very practical question of like, okay, what is our ecclesiology on this?
Yeah. And I think realistically, like, that's something that any church that decides to jump into the metaverse side of things has to keep in mind, that our calling is to make disciples. Like, we want every aspect of somebody's life to reflect and represent Jesus in everything that they do. So that's like how they're parenting, how they go about marriage, relationships, their work environments. Like, the idea is that they put on the newness that is Jesus and carry that into every aspect of their lives. And so as we're meeting people within the metaverse, that still has to remain the goal of introducing people to Jesus that leads to life change, new followers who then go off and make more disciples. So as a church goes into the metaverse, then that has to be the ultimate goal, which means even bringing some of those elements in and walking alongside people as they continue on their spiritual journey. So I remember that this was a question that my executive pastor asked me at one point, probably like a year or so ago, of what does it look like? And the reason why he asked is because I was mentioning that we had a couple that were attending our services weekly that they were in a dating, what seemed like a dating relationship. I guess I'll say it that way. This seemed like a dating relationship. And so I was communicating this, and he then says, so if they're dating, does that mean that they could get married in virtual reality? And I was like, whoa, what an interesting question. Because the thing was, like, they lived in two different parts of the world even.
Yep.
But yet they were attending church and they were doing like life with each other, I guess, in VR. And it's just like, man, there seems to be a lot of probably logistical hoops to jump through in order for that to be a real thing. Like, how do you allow one person who lives in like South Africa get married to somebody who lives in like Alaska, all through a VR platform? Now, realistically, like legal wise, I don't know that you can do that. First of all, you might know that better than I do. But what I do know is if that same couple, then that's a theoretical couple. Let's say that same couple decided that they did want to move forward with getting married with each other. I kind of sit here in the seat going, I'll walk through premarital with you guys, because most of like the premarital that my wife and I did, and some premarital that I've done with other people have all been, hey, here's a digital booklet. Here is a website that I need you to go through. Fill out the information on there. That information then computes and compiles it all for me to look at as the person who's walking you through premarital or marriage counseling. That way I can see what the story reads for the groom to be or the husband, and same thing for the bride to be or the wife. And then we can sit down and have a conversation, see where things not matching up, where do we need to work together in order to move forward. And so I sit here in the seat going, man, if somebody who attends the Lakeland VR wants to go through premarital or marriage counseling, I would sit there and say, cool, okay, then let's do this, because we have a common ground place in order to meet. But what would be, Goose, some of those logistics for that? What are some of the legal ramifications that would have to be considered?
Well, legally, it's going to be very difficult or if not impossible, for two people in different countries to get married, and so that may may take care of some of these on their own. But I do still think it's important to establish the ecclesiology, even if it were legal, because there may be ways around it. There may be there are certainly ways you can do it. But what I thought was interesting about the last run that we had, which is relevant to this conversation, is part of our conversation. You were talking about how we are communicating, you and I, and
Yep.
we are friends, and through digital means. And I was thinking through all of the friends that I've made through digital means. But what I had to stop and think, because I genuinely could not remember, and I was wrong actually. What I thought is, I was thinking, have you and I ever actually been in the same room together? And I could have sworn that we had, but then as we talked about it, we realized no, we hadn't. I thought maybe one of the conferences we had been to, surely you were there and I was there, and I could have sworn yes, no, we haven't. And to me, that was just indicative of how tight of a bond people can form over digital means.
Yes.
To the point where you just can't even remember, have we actually been in the same room together? And maybe it's just because I'm old, but the point is, we know we can, you can become very close over digital means. And this has brought us to the point where people are asking, well, can you become so close that you can get married and it be a legitimate marriage? And so, the first question that has come up, we haven't had to deal with it, but it has come up with it, which is on the easy side, on one end of the spectrum of what I would call the easiest question, which is still not easy, but it's the easiest, is if you've got two people living in the same place, presumably attending the same church, and they both like VR, they're both gamers or whatever it may be, and they say, hey, we want to get married, and but we want our wedding to be in VR. And so essentially only the wedding would be in VR and everything else would be the way that we would expect it to be. They would get married, however they would do that. Then they would live together and be husband and wife and so on and so forth. That's one question. That is a question. All right. But all the way on the other side is the one that you've posed, which is you've got a man and a woman in very distant places. They have become very, very close over digital means, VR or some other. And they say, we want to get married over VR and we want to continue to live separately and be married. And our mode of relationship is digital. That is one of the questions. Now, that's not actually the instance that we have, but that's sort of what we're dealing with. The way that we've processed it is similar to you, although we have dug in a little bit on this because we've kind of had to, because now we've got someone who's talking about it, and we're like, okay, if this keeps going, what are we willing to do and what we're not? What are we not willing to do? What's the criteria? And where we have settled on it is the biblical requirements for marriage really do require people to be in the same place. That's our take on it. So we would not go forward with any sort of marriage discussion, whether it's premarital or not, unless there was at least the covenant with us between the two people that once they are married, they are going to be in the same place. The main part of that is the biblical mandate for consummation of the marriage. I mean, that is biblical, and as an ongoing thing, it is a critical part of marriage. And there's, we could have there are entire podcast series on the role of sex in marriage, but suffice it to say, it is an absolutely critical part of marriage. And so because of that, I mean, there are a whole host of other reasons why being in the same place, living in the same house, being physically connected, physically present, a whole host of other reasons why. But that one single thing you just cannot get around. And so for us, that is at least a requirement. And so in our instance, in our case, what we've sort of decided, and this isn't locked in, so I'm not, saying that this is definitely our stated procedure or system, but at the very least, we would require to do any sort of premarital discussions that at least there was the covenant. Yes, once we get married, we are going to live in the same place. We would not sanction Cornerstone. We wouldn't sanction a wedding for two people who are saying explicitly, we're not going to live in the same place. So,
yeah, dude, you got my brain rocking on two different topics right now, because Old Testament, we see this in Old Testament where it was law that when a man and a woman came together, they got married, the man wasn't even allowed to go to war for, I think it was the first year of the marriage. They were supposed to just focus entirely on this new thing of them being a married couple. So you were talking about okay, are you guys going to come together by the time that this is all said and done? When you say your I do's, are you going to be under the same roof? And I would say if it's showing up in scripture of the importance that, man, a dude's not even supposed to go to war within a time frame, or I think it was even go to work or be gone for any extended period of time. It was a law that they had to be at home and focus in on that marriage. It was their duty and their responsibility. The other thing that you mentioned in there, though, that I had never thought about before in regards to this question, and again, this is the broad, and I'm taking notes in order to keep my thoughts in line, but the very far end of that spectrum that I mentioned of like two people living on two different continents, even like how odd that is in our day and age, because most premarital that I'm doing today, my question that I usually have to ask, and it shows up in any like premarital questionnaire, whether it's like Preparing Rich or, you know, whatever, Symbis, is the question of like, hey, are you guys living with each other already?
Yeah. Yeah.
And yet the far end of the spectrum that we're talking about here is like, hey, do you guys have any intention to ever live with each other? Or is your lifestyle, your living situation always just going to be via VR? Which is it's concerning, right? It is, because like I do believe, oddly enough, that there are probably people out there that will sit there and say, I can have a married relationship with an individual that I never actually see face to face, because everything that I know about them is through a headset, it's through a screen. But what we've talked about already is like you can get very deep with somebody relationally by getting to know them, because of like what is hidden. Like you're not so much focused on the physical features, the physical attraction of the individual, but you can actually know them at a heart level. That it can actually spur you into this deep, intimate relationship with that individual that you can say, I don't care what you look like I love you. Like I want to be with you. I love this person that I have built an attachment to, that you could say, yes, I will be married to this individual. It's scary. But I think that there are probably people out there that are already falling along those lines. The thing that also got us when my executive pastor asked the question was, because of how little you can know about somebody coming into this, like even take what I just said, like two people fall in love with each other who get to know each other on that deep, intimate level, like they get to know each other's hearts and everything. But at the end of the day, you don't know whether or not that person that you're building this intimate relationship with, who lives in South Africa while you live in Alaska, you don't know if they're already married to somebody else and they're sick and tired, burnt out on the relationship. It seems to be in a downward spiral. So they're looking for an escape and they're finding it through VR and they're finding it through you. And you feel like that you're getting something in a marital relationship via VR while they actually have a marital relationship in reality. So there's a lot of tricky situations that go along with any of this.
And to that point, you know, so that identifies a risk of somebody that's like actively, nefariously, you know, being someone else. But I think far more than that, it's just that we aren't our full selves in this. And again, I mean, I get the authenticity side of it. So I'm not saying that there's something that we're hiding. What I'm saying is, like, you know, you and I have never had to argue what the thermostat ought to be in the room that we're doing our podcast in. And, right? Like there are just things that don't come up because we have the separation. And the same thing is true if you were to have, you know, a quote unquote marriage or something that resembled it. So much of what goes into what makes marriage difficult is the fact that you are just with someone all of the time. But it's supposed to be that way. We become one flesh. A man leaves his father and mother and cleaves to his wife. All the biblical things, those aren't just like metaphors and flowery language. It's literally like, no, you go and you be with her and you are together, and all of the things that you are doing life together, the sort of, you know, organic things that life throws at you when you are in the same place and having to navigate that. That's marriage. And you know that, and I know that everybody who's married knows that. And so much of the digital relationship has like a sheen on it because you don't have to deal with all that. And it's okay. It doesn't negate the beauty of the digital relationships. We have to be honest about what they are and what the good and the bad. You know, Some of that's good. It's great that we don't have some of the, you know, arguments and debates that we might have to have. But then on the other hand, it's so just being in that same physical location, and then again, not to make too fine of a point of it, but the consummation and the sex in marriage. I mean, that is the thing that forces people to grow together and be and to deal with issues together. I mean, because you cannot remain bitter and have a vibrant sex life with someone. Like, if there's a problem, it's gonna be realized in that, because either it's not going to be going well, or or you're going to have to you're going to have to deal with it so that you can get back to that healthy sex life. And so that's again why the that physical proximity. It's just you cannot do it without it. And again, that's not to say that there aren't relationships where sometimes that physical proximity, there are seasons where that, there are guys who go to the military or other types of things. I get that, but they all know that's not the paradigm. Like, that's the exception for the sacrifice that they're making. And, so anyway.
So can we, can I play devil's advocate for a second?
Yeah, absolutely.
So anybody who is investigating the idea of bringing their church or starting a church in the metaverse, virtual reality, ARM, what have you, they will most likely, and we've talked about it on this podcast, that you could find yourself in VR chat. And people have talked about how VR chat is like the wild, wild west of the VR platforms, where pretty much anything and everything goes, including sex. Mm-hmm. So for the person, this is going to be my devil's advocate. Let me speak to it's not necessarily the skeptic person, but the person who is fighting for this. Like Goose, I can have sex with my VR wife in VR chat.
Yeah. Well, you can't. You can have a version of it, but it isn't the one that honors the Lord, because if you want to do this biblically, sex has the dual purpose of relationship and procreation. And so while you could maybe convince me that I don't think you will, but you can make at least a cogent argument that the relationship side can be satisfied through VR chat. Obviously, the procreation side can't. Yeah. And that's the paradigm, and that's what everybody should be operating out of. And all of the other outliers about, well, what about people who can't conceive and all that? That doesn't matter. It's either legitimate or it's not. And in this case, it's not. It can never result in procreation. So it's never a form that honors the Lord. So that would be my response. It's more nuanced than that, but for the sake of this discussion, I think that's probably a good enough. That's probably the answer that I would give. But that's good. Yeah, it still doesn't work.
Yeah, it's good. So you got a question that you want to tee up that you're excited about. So I'll conclude our conversation here on like the premarital marriage side, because while everything we talked about has to do with that, I would love to tie this up with a pretty bow by saying this. Like, these are the questions that have to be thought through when it comes to even considering doing premarital or marriage counseling with somebody in VR. Like, the fact that some of the stuff that's been highlighted, like the majority of the questions that we ask in physical counseling of like, hey, are you two living with each other currently? Because let's address that issue first. In VR, the question might have to be, do you have any intention of ever living under the same roof? So there might be a new layer that for churches we have to add to our marriage premarital counseling list of questions to ask when it comes to, hey, is this moving in a healthy direction, not only for you two as individuals, but you for a couple, and for the greatest representation of what God has in mind? Because really the idea of two sinful individual people coming together to be that representation of Christ and the church, like, that's what's at stake here. It's not so much the representation of who you guys are as a married couple, because really, as much as I want you to have the greatest love story of all time, what I ultimately want more is I want people to see Jesus and his love for his people through your guys' relationship. So you mentioned, Goose, as I tie this up completely now, you mentioned like the thermostat idea. Like you and I have always had the perfect room temperature for our podcasting for us as individuals, because we are in control of our own thermostats because we're not recording in the same room. But it's those tension points, the idea of the shared finances that you might not have to worry about if you're trying to do a virtual marriage. It's the tensions of the fighting that you have to go through. It's the the soul care of one another that you have to go through. I've been told it's the tension on the knot makes the knot tighter. And if you're living for this VR virtual marriage concept, like you said, like that shear that's over, it doesn't ever, like if you're trying to avoid the tension of marriage, or you're trying to avoid the tension that comes along with marriage, then you're never going to make that knot tighter and keep you two closer and tighter with each other at the same time. So
that's well put.
For the churches who are listening to this, my encouragement would be we're going to have to wrestle through these questions and probably start thinking through a whole new lens and perspective as we enter into the metaverse of what does it really look like for us to lead people towards a Christ-centered marriage when those people that we're talking to are all coming from VR. Like, what are those all new questions that we have to wrestle through?
Yeah, and I would just say to the people who are in VR who are thinking through this and think maybe they want to marry somebody that they've met, like I don't hear that, at least for me, which I'm just one person, but don't hear that I think that it can't be done. But there is a way to honor the Lord with that relationship, and the coming together is absolutely key. And really, I think that should be an encouragement. I think there should be an encouragement out there. And I really actually think that there can be some really beautiful stories, like you have kind of pointed out, where people actually are getting to know each other without all of the other noise that sometimes happens in the world as we meet people, and people genuinely come to love each other, because that I absolutely believe can be a thing. But then decide, okay, we are going to honor the Lord with this and take that further step and make sure every aspect of this is biblical. And so, I see this as a great opportunity, but we do have to be awfully careful that we are following what Scripture says.
Yep, absolutely. All right, bro. All right. You ready to take it?
You always ask the questions. And so I have a good friend who wants to ask the question. I'm just going to pose this to you. I'm not even going to answer it. If you had to pick one fictional character to be your best friend for the rest of your life, who would it be and why?
Wow. Holy cow. So I guess I don't have like a legitimate answer to this, so I'm just gonna go with the first name that's popping into my head as you ask that question. So it's kind of like one of those word association games, and I'm gonna go with Gandalf. Don't ask me why. I don't have any legitimate reason.
No, but I did ask why. So what would be the best part of having Gandalf as your best friend?
That's fair. Okay, so here would be the reason why. He's never early nor late. He arrives precisely when he means to.
Wow.
And he wouldn't forget my Uncle Bilbo's birthday.
You win.
Oh, that's a good question. I love it. Right?
My buddy has good questions. Well, I'm gonna tap him for some more, and maybe we'll throw those at the end of the podcast from time to time.
Yeah, dude, I love it. Cool. Well, you ready to call this one a wrap for this episode?
Yeah, good stuff.
Yeah, this was a great episode. So, hey, if you guys have any further questions, really on even just picking gooses in my brain when it comes to this idea of bringing premarital and marriage counseling into your expression of VR, or you just want to have a further conversation on this, maybe there's something that you completely disagree with us as we have this conversation, we're totally open to that. We're still learning and figuring this out as we go as well. And we're excited with what God wants to do. But the best way that you can do that is you can reach out to us at the Metaverse Church Podcast at gmail.com, or you can join our Discord. All of those links will be down in the show notes. One thing that you can do to help us out is share this episode with other people if you found it helpful for yourself or just insightful. You can subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode, and then leave a rating and a review. Those things help get this out to more people. And I will say, Goose, by the time that this episode drops, I'm going to be just getting back from speaking and attending the Exponential Conference in Orlando, and there is a whole focus on the digital and metaverse side of things. So this is a growing concept of church in the metaverse. So I'm really excited with what God's wanting to do in this area. I think God's moving in it, and I think He's really awakening His church to the opportunity that is before us in it. So, but you do all those things, and it helps get it out to more people. But on behalf of Goose and myself, thank you once again for listening, and we'll see you next week for another episode of the Metaverse Church Podcast. Be blessed.